August 19th, 1944. Wolfschanze, East Prussia. The war room smelled of cigarette smoke and cold sweat. Maps lay strewn across long oak tables, their edges curled, ash falling onto penciled arrows that traced the desperate German retreat across France. A lone lamp flickered, throwing shadows over weary faces. General Oberst Alfred Jodl hunched forward, scanning a set of reports delivered only hours earlier from the collapsing Western Front. His staff had run the numbers again and again, scribbling in notebooks smudged with graphite. The arithmetic was merciless. The Americans had broken free of Normandy's hedgerows, their armored spearheads under General George S. Patton's Third Army racing eastward at a pace no German planner believed sustainable. In just 30 days, they had advanced nearly 400 miles. Tanks, half-tracks, infantry columns, all of it consumed fuel, ammunition, and food at a rate no supply line in history had ever supported. Jodl stubbed out his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "Paralysis," he muttered. "They cannot continue. No army can outrun its logistics." Around him, staff officers nodded. They remembered 1941, how the mighty Wehrmacht had surged into Russia with lightning ferocity, only to collapse against the tyranny of supply lines. Horse-drawn wagons had bogged down on Russian mud roads. Fuel and ammunition stockpiled hundreds of miles behind unreachable railheads. Now Jodl believed the Americans would suffer the same fate. One report from General Heinrich von Lettwitz spelled it out bluntly. The Americans faced the same logistical impossibility we faced in Russia. Their mechanical advantage becomes a disadvantage. Machines require fuel, ammunition, parts. They have advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History teaches us what comes next. Paralysis. The math supported the conclusion. A single Sherman tank burned half a mile's worth of gasoline per gallon. An armored division consumed over 150,000 gallons per day when advancing. Infantry divisions required 700 tons daily. Armored divisions, 1,000. Patton commanded 12 divisions spread across a 60-mile front. That meant at least 12,000 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, every single day. And all of it had to be hauled forward over cratered French roads, across rivers with blown bridges, through a transportation network the Germans had systematically wrecked. Jodl tapped the table. They cannot possibly sustain this. Within 48 hours, the American drive will stop. The Third Army will freeze in place. It was a reasonable calculation. It was also wrong, because even as Jodl spoke, 125 miles to the west, engines already thundered to life. 5,958 trucks, painted olive drab, were forming into convoys, headlights blazing in open defiance of blackout orders. Inside the cabs, young men, most of them African American, many barely trained drivers, gripped their steering wheels with nervous determination. They were about to roll eastward into history, hauling 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours along roads the Germans swore could never sustain such a miracle. This was the birth of the Red Ball Express. By late August 1944, Allied forces had transformed a precarious beachhead into a rolling juggernaut. The breakout from Normandy at St. Lo had shattered German defenses. Patton's Third Army swept south and east like an unleashed predator, outpacing German attempts to regroup. Paris was liberated on August 25th. The frontier of Germany loomed closer by the day, but speed was both blessing and curse. Every mile forward was another mile farther from the ports at Cherbourg and the temporary Mulberry harbors still operating off the Normandy coast. Railroads across France lay twisted and bombed, their bridges reduced to rubble by Allied air power during the summer campaign. Pipelines were still being laid, inch by inch. Depots could not leapfrog fast enough. The U.S. Army's logistical staff sounded alarms. Colonel Charles Thrasher of the Advanced Section, Communications Zone ADSEC, recalled. The normal system had broken down completely. Supplies could not be moved fast enough. Traditional rail and depot methods collapsed. Something new had to be created, or the offensive would grind to a halt. Without a solution, Patton's armored thrust, his very strategy of relentless forward momentum, would falter. Fuel would run out. Tanks would sit silent. Artillery pieces would go unfired. Worse, the pause would give the Germans time to reorganize, dig in, and perhaps even counterattack. For Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters, the choice was stark. Invent a new way to move mountains of material, or lose the initiative purchased in blood since D-Day. On August 20th, 1944, in a requisitioned French chateau near Le Mans, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres of the Motor Transport Service gathered his officers. The room buzzed with tension. Charts and fuel estimates covered the walls. Every calculation screamed impossibility. Ayres looked at them and declared, "Gentlemen, we are going to build a one-way highway. Trucks will run 20 hours out of every 24. No stops except for gas or emergency. Convoys will not yield to anyone. We will move at least 12,000 tons daily. The Americans will not stop." The idea drew on railroad practice. In U.S. freight yards, a red ball train was the highest priority express, cleared of all obstructions, given absolute right-of-way. Ayres borrowed the term for his highway. Thus was born the Red Ball Express, a dedicated, one-way loop of roads running from the Normandy beaches eastward to the front. Two parallel routes. One for loaded trucks heading forward, one for empties returning. Civilian traffic was banned. Military police checkpoints enforced speed and spacing. Convoys would move day and night. Headlights on. Interval fixed at 5 minutes. Mobile repair units would be stationed every 50 miles. Logistics textbooks said it couldn't be done. Yet within 36 hours, the impossible was rolling. The lifeblood of the Red Ball Express was not steel or gasoline. It was the men behind the wheel. About 23,000 drivers rotated through the operation during its 82-day lifespan. More than 73% of them were African American, drawn from segregated quartermaster truck companies. In an army that still denied black soldiers combat roles in many frontline units, these men were often relegated to labor or transport. Yet here in France, they became the indispensable artery of victory. Private John Houston of the 3,940th Quartermaster Truck Company remembered, "You didn't stop. You didn't argue. You just drove. Some days I'd be behind that will 20 hours straight. If you broke down, you prayed you weren't sitting on a minefield. But the fuel had to get there." Patton's tanks didn't run on promises. There was bitter irony. These soldiers carried the army forward while eating in segregated mess halls, sleeping in separate camps, and returning to a country that still enforced Jim Crow. Yet without them, Patton's blitz would have sputtered out in the French countryside. Red Ball discipline was unforgiving. Convoys consisted of at least 5 trucks, led and tailed by jeeps with white flags marked with red balls. Trucks maintained a minimum 60-yard interval. Passing was forbidden. Speed was capped around 25 miles per hour, though many drivers secretly disabled their governors and pushed faster. Only 2 stops were allowed: refueling or emergency repair. Military police manned traffic control points. Any truck that fell below speed was pulled from the convoy. At Alençon, a midpoint relay station, vehicles refueled, crews rotated, and mechanics worked frantically under floodlights. At night, drivers rolled with cat-eye headlights, faint slits of light barely illuminating the broken French roads. Rain turned the routes into mud slicks. Dust choked engines by day. Sleep was a luxury. Crashes were common. Corporal Eddie Washington later said, "The road never ended. Day-night. It was the same. Headlights in front, taillights behind. Like you were inside a snake of steel that just kept moving east." Trucks were the deuce and a half, GM CCCKW, nicknamed the Jimmy. They were reliable but not invincible. Loads were heavy, often overloaded with extra jerry cans and ammo crates. Roads were pitted with shell holes, bridges jury-rigged with planks. Breakdowns were constant. Estimates suggest up to 30% of trucks required repair on any given day. Tires shredded, engines overheated, axles snapped. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks for parts, working around the clock. Yet the trucks kept rolling. By mid-September, over 200,000 tons of supplies had been delivered, an astonishing figure for an improvised operation that technically wasn't supposed to work. To German soldiers retreating east, the Red Ball Express became a psychological weapon. At night, they could hear the endless hum of American engines across the countryside. It seemed unending, a mechanical tide. Wehrmacht units rationed their last shells while Americans poured in gasoline, food, and bullets as if they had no limit. One captured German officer admitted later, "We believed the Americans could not possibly supply so many machines. Yet every night we heard their convoys. It was as if they had built a factory on wheels." What the Germans perceived as industrial sorcery was in fact the grinding labor of thousands of young men behind steering wheels, fighting fatigue, fear, and prejudice with every mile. By the first week of September, the Red Ball Express was delivering over 12,500 tons daily, sometimes spiking higher when demands peaked. In total, between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, the Express carried 412,193 tons of supplies across 122 million ton miles. The metaphor became obvious. The road was an artery. The trucks were blood cells. The supplies, oxygen. And Patton's Third Army was the beating heart, pumping eastward, unstoppable so long as the lifeline flowed. Without it, the heart would have stopped. With it, the German generals who laughed at American logistics found themselves crushed under its weight. The Red Ball Express was more than trucks on a highway. It was an audacious defiance of physics, a victory of improvisation, and a testament to the men, mostly African American, who drove through exhaustion, mud, and fear to keep an army alive. As Patton himself said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." And thanks to the Red Ball Express, they did. As dusk fell over bomb-scarred Normandy fields, 1,000 trucks rumbled to life in depots. Headlights cut faint streaks across broken roads. The highway became something alive, a steel serpent breathing supply eastward. Under a darkening French sky, drivers strapped in. Engines warmed. Whispered prayers between men. The road ahead was long, the danger real, but the supply line must flow. Overhead, invisible watchers listened. German units often claimed that the Red Ball's hum at night sounded like an unending motor engine choir. That sound became lore, that even in darkness, American will rolled. The Red Ball Express would never have run without its drivers. And for many of those drivers, the assignment was something they never asked for, but would embrace. Approximately 73% of truck companies in the European theater's motor transport service were African American. Because of that, the majority of Red Ball units were black companies. Nearly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American servicemen, declares the National WWII Museum in its article, "Keep 'em Rolling." Many of these men had never driven large trucks or traveled beyond their home states, but war demanded. The Army pulled personnel from ports, supply depots, even infantry units whose assignments were less urgent. Every able soldier with some driving skill was pressed into service. One driver, James Rookard, recalled the terror of moving at night under cat eyes. He said, "We had to drive slowly at night because we had to use cat eyes, and you could hardly see. If you turned on your headlights, the Germans could bomb the whole convoy." The irony wasn't lost on these men. Soldiers denied frontline combat duty due to segregation, but entrusted with one of the most dangerous, essential missions of the war. They were the backbone of the Express, driving miles under fire, stress, and exhaustion so the tanks could roll. The workhorse of the Red Ball Express was the GMC-CCKW 2-ton truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half. It was rugged, relatively easy to repair, and widely available. Heavier trucks, tractors, and semi-trailers were considered, but logistics, production, and maintenance favored the Deuce. The Army estimated that 3 semi-trailers per tractor would be ideal, but war reality forced reliance on the 2-ton trucks. One source describes the fleet. A fleet of over 6,000 trucks and trailers delivered over 412,000 tons of Class I, III, V, and IX, and some to the Allied armies in the European Theater of Operations (ETO). Trucks were often loaded beyond nominal capacity. Overweight loads, rough roads, wet conditions, and constant use meant constant breakdowns. Tires shredded, axles snapped, engines overheated. Spare parts were cannibalized from disabled trucks. Mechanics followed behind in mobile repair vehicles, patched broken trucks, swapped parts, realigned wheels. They sometimes worked under floodlights in rain and mud, often on the shoulders of roads where bombs had smashed pavement. Every day, schedules blurred. Drivers often went 36 hours without sleep. Rest stops were minimal. Bivouac areas were little more than rough clearings, tents, and cold meals. Rules were strict. Maintain 60-yard intervals, no passing, max speed about 25 miles per hour, though many trucks ran faster unofficially. MPs controlled intersections, regulated convoy flow, removed slow vehicles, flagged disabled trucks. Stragglers were vulnerable. In the earliest phases, when routes were short to the Seine, full headlights were allowed at night. But as the express extended deeper, risk of German air raids forced use of cat-eye slitted headlight covers. That dim light made driving nerve-wracking. One veteran driver recalled passing troops dug into shell craters, bodies strewn by road edges, the smell of exploded fuel and smoke. Trucks bumped past in long lines, barely seeing hazards ahead. Enemy action loomed. Convoyed trucks had jeeps escorting some convoys with mounted 50 caliber machine guns on some trucks for defense. Artillery shelling of roads, strafing by Luftwaffe though limited in Normandy skies by 1944, mines, broken bridges, all threats. One convoy was knocked off route by a damaged bridge. 8 semi-trailers went over an embankment. Tire shortages became acute. Usage skyrocketed. Between June-August, average tire usage was 29,142 per month. By September, usage jumped to 55,059. By early October, spares in the theater dwindled. Trucks ran flat tires over discarded ration cans littering roads, over rough, broken pavement. Brake failures warped drums, loosened bolts. Every mile tested men and machines. At peak performance, late August, Red Ball convoys delivered over 12,342 tons in a single day. At peak, 5,958 vehicles were assigned to the express. Average trucks on the road daily hovered at 899 vehicles, but that volume declined as the rail network was restored and supply routes shortened. After October 25th, daily tonnage often dropped below 3,000 tons. Mobile depots and railheads began absorbing some traffic. The Red Ball was gradually phased out by November 16, 1944. Even as tonnage fell, breakdowns flew high. By September, over 5,750 vehicles required major repairs. Fuel consumption by the convoys themselves was enormous, tens or hundreds of thousands of gallons daily, just to keep the supply line rolling. Still, the scale and persistence of throughput made the Red Ball Express more than a makeshift patch. It became a demonstration that forward momentum in modern land warfare must be matched by logistics. The artery sustained the push, drivers the red blood, trucks the pulse. The night convoys were the heartbeat in France's dark veins. September 1st, 1944. Nightfall over northern France. The sky was a quilt of stars. Thin moonlight filtered through drifting smoke and mist, and the roads glowed faintly under the soft thrum of engines. The Red Ball Express routes, scarred by bomb craters and oil slicks, stretched onward, ribboning eastward into heartland that Germans thought safe from supply nightmares. This was the road Germans heard, constant, unceasing. The exhaust, the rumble, the wheels on broken pavement. A sound that remarked, every mile, that Allied supply arteries beat with life. Patton's thunder was marching on gas and rubber and sheer will. By early September, the Red Ball Express had pushed its routes into deeper France. Engineers opened new bridges, repaired roadbeds, and mapped one-way flows so that forward-bound trucks and return empties never crossed. The northern branch reached as far as Herson, the southern toward Soissons. Round-trip route mileage now spanned 686 miles on the northern loop, 590 on the southern. With every extra mile came cumulative strain. Fuel for the trucks themselves, food and sleep for drivers, oil for motors, new tires. Average trip duration stretched. Some round trips took 71.2 hours to complete, including maintenance and delay. Volume numbers rose. At peak operation, nearly 5,400 trucks were assigned, dispatching 8,200 plus tons in a single day over routes of more than 700 round-trip miles. Yet not every day was peak. Rain turned dirt roads into quagmires. Bridges flooded, routes washed out. One convoy delayed for hours when repair crews patched bomb-torn causeways. Traffic rerouted over muddy backroads. Drivers spent more time behind the wheel under darkness than daylight. Orders permitted full headlights seldom. Usually they used cat eyes, slits and covers to limit visibility. James Rookard, A 19-year-old driver later remembered. We had to drive slowly at night because we had to use cat eyes, and you could hardly see. If you turned on your headlights, the Germans could bomb the whole convoy. Yet even with limited light, trucks raced on. The darkness didn't stop the flow, it sharpened nerves. So many trucks with diesel burning, lights dimmed, drivers hunched, windows open to hear approaching danger. The night drove home how fragile the lifeline was. One wrong move, one bomb, one blind curve could end a driver, a load, or both. To keep the artery open, machines took casualties. The red ball trucks were beaten down every mile. Batteries dried, engines overloaded, drive shafts twisted, bolts loosened. Transmission gears ground under extra load. Tires were especially a problem. Sharp tin cans discarded along roads shredded rubber. In the first month, over 40,000 tires were expended. Many were retreaded. Many patched. At repair depots, piles of parted treads awaited to be grafted back. Rear dual tires sometimes failed under pressure, catching fire from hot rims. Condensation, water and fuel, poorly filtered gas. Every problem multiplied. One veteran reports refusing to blind mount a convoy until filters were purged. Others had to deal with gas contamination mid-route. Mechanics and wreckers followed convoys. When a truck died, sometimes a diamond T-prime mover would pull it out. If beyond repair, load transferred to another truck. Driver hopped in another if available. Maintenance teams were mobile, literally patch camps along the route. U.S. Army transportation. The physical and mental cost weighed on drivers. Many were young, late teens, early 20s, dragged from enlistment centers or depot duty. Few had expected to face nightly terror, fatigue, broken roads. Yet they accepted. One driver said, "There were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after bombs dropped. I was scared, but I did my job, hoping for the best." Being young and about 4,000 miles away from home, anybody would be scared. They slept in cold trucks when rest areas were full, often with only clasped hands around gear, engine idling nearby. Meals came cold, sea rations, stew, sometimes warmed by exhaust manifolds. One man wired his tin of stew to his truck's exhaust to heat it, forgot to remove it, and nearly caught the truck on fire. Segregation lurked even in supply lines. Many black drivers, mechanics, and support staff experienced discrimination, lower pay, poorer living quarters, fewer home front letters, delayed promotions. Yet they kept rolling, pushing through both enemy territory and institutional barriers. Their courage quietly spoke volumes. German intelligence had predicted that supply would break before frontline units did. They observed Allied fuel consumption, saw stretched supply lines, expected American armored advance to slow. But they underestimated the will, the improvisation, the horsepower of endless American trucking. POWs noted that drivers sometimes carried dead soldiers back, that bodies and expended shells littered the roads behind supply trucks. The Germans heard convoys at night, engines rumbling long after sunset, suggesting endless movement. For Wehrmacht officers, the concept of an express supply highway operating 24/7, through darkness, through wrecked terrain, powered by segregated troops, was alien. But each successful delivery hammered home the lesson. Industrial capacity and logistics innovation could match or exceed battlefield firepower. The morale effect on German infantry was real. Soldiers near the front lines, rationing bullets and fuel, occasionally glimpsed American tanks, always backed by their supply. Resistance mounting in towns looking east heard trucks before saw tanks. The road itself seemed to promise inexorable advance. The Red Ball Express officially ran from August 25 to November 16, 1944. 81 days of continuous supply hustle. Over that period, convoys transported 412,193 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, rations to forward depots. They logged nearly 122 million ton miles, the cumulative distance all the loads traveled. Peak daily delivery reached 12,342 tons, carried by 5,958 trucks from 132 truck companies just 4 days after launch. But as the Allies captured more ports like Antwerp, repaired more rail lines, and pipelines came online, the need for long red ball routes decreased. By early November, daily tonnages had dropped to between 1,500 to 2,000 tons for many days. Fewer truck companies remained. Maintenance burden and driver fatigue were crushing. Still, until the final convoy ran, the Express was more than a supply line. It was a machine of war, kept alive by tires, midnight oil, and human determination. The road, once only a path of invasion, now pulsed with lifeblood. The engines were the heartbeat, the dark sky the canvas of struggle. Every mile of French parked terrain, every dented fender, every cargo of flame or food was a line in a larger story, that of supply becoming strategy, logistics becoming victory. August 25, 1944. A French crossroads, east of the Seine. Patton's Third Army was pushing forward under a sky bruised with smoke. American tanks roared through hedgerows, infantry advanced over rubble, and somewhere behind them, an endless line of trucks carried the fuel, ammunition, and food that made the thunder possible. The Red Ball Express wasn't merely a logistical trick. It was the engine of Patton's lightning-fast advance. What the Germans believed was a tactical pause became an operational surge, turning momentum into inevitability. Just days after its launch on August 25th, the Red Ball Express reached its first great crescendo. With 5,958 vehicles on the road, the Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies in one day, fuel, ammo, rations, everything required to keep the front moving. The requirement for fuel alone was staggering. The First and Third Armies together were burning nearly 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day by late August. Without daily truck convoys, Patton's armored divisions would have ground to a halt. One vivid moment. As Patton's forces approached Paris on August 27th, the Allies crossed the Seine River and continued eastward without waiting for lines of communication to fully restore. That decision, fueled by the Red Ball's momentum, caught the German staff off guard. By early September, supply routes were split. One branch moving northeast toward Soissons to support First Army, the other southeast for the Third. The Express stretched its tentacles, and so did Patton's tank columns. German generals believed that logistical overreach did what it always had, created vulnerability. Supply lines stretched, fuel exhausted, mechanical breakdowns multiplied. They assumed the Americans might surge forward, but expected them to pause once fuel, winter, or terrain caught up. Instead, the Red Ball Express turned all three assumptions upside down. Trucks ran through rain and mud, repair parties patched bridges and roads, and drivers pressed forward without stopping, except for gas or emergencies. Captured German intelligence reports later acknowledged their surprise. Supply was no longer the bottleneck they had expected. Instead, the American capability to maintain supply convoys 24/7, deliver hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel, and stretch supply depots forward so rapidly forced the Wehrmacht to rethink defensive priorities. Hard evidence. Gasoline reserves in some forward units that should have run dry were replenished overnight. Some divisions that were assumed stalled were able to resume full offensive posture within days because supply trucks continued to roll. By September 2, 1944, Patton's spearhead had crossed the Meuse River and reached Verdun. The liberation of Verdun was as symbolic as it was strategic. A town scarred from World War I now falling to fast-rolling American armor. But Verdun's capture would not have been possible without continuous supply. Fuel consumed during the days leading up to the Meuse crossing had to be delivered daily through convoys that faced road sabotage, flooded rivers, and unpredictable weather. German resistance in Lorraine attempted to slow the advance at Metz and Nancy, but American forces, powered by Red Ball, were able to outflank and envelop positions. Logistics doctrine taught, a stalled supply line equals a stalled army. But here, supply was moving faster than German countermeasures. The Express was forged in urgency. Patton once remarked, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." That mandate shaped decisions. Trucks were pushed hard. Maintenance was often deferred. War planners accepted that wear and tear would spike. Many trucks were overloaded. Preventive care was minimal. In one example, tire usage skyrocketed. In September alone, shipments of tires nearly doubled previous monthly rates. Many tires were damaged by metal fragments, country debris, or simply use. Wheels scored, rims overheated. Engines blew when air filters clogged with dust. Yet, despite these sacrifices, speed often won. The risk of mechanical breakdown was small compared to the risk of giving Germans time to entrench. Patton's gamble. Supply won't be perfect, but it must be relentless. When Paris liberated on August 25th, the Express played a direct role. Supply convoys made sure forward units, those sealing the city, securing suburbs, were not starved for ammunition or fuel. Their mobility and ability to encircle German garrisons depended on supply just ahead of the fight. Reims, Soissons, Verdun all saw Allied units maintaining pressure on German lines not because tanks outnumbered, but because tanks stayed fueled. Artillery support did not fade. Ammunition continued to arrive. By mid-September, the First Army had extended supply manipulation north of Paris. Third Army's march through Lorraine toward Germany kept its heels on German retreats. The Express had extended eastward to supporting routes near Herson and Salmacis. Some supply points even reached toward Verdun and Metz unofficially. Despite the roaring engine of Red Ball, the supply chain had its cracks. In late August, even with Red Ball running, Third Army experienced days with severe fuel shortages. On August 28th, gasoline deliveries fell about 100,000 gallons short of requirements. Though the trucks were rolling, infrastructure hadn't caught up. Piers, pipelines, rail depots, some still unusable. Some forward divisions paused while waiting for supply. The weather turned, slowing roads. At times, the volume of supplies reaching frontline units was less than requested. Priority allocation sometimes diverted to First Army or to civil affairs in liberated towns. Yet pauses were temporary. Supplies, once arriving, allowed resumption of offensive operations. Mobility never fully stopped. Key attacks were timed with incoming convoys, so fuel and ammo arrived just in time to support forward armor. Germans monitored the Red Ball with alarm. Senior Wehrmacht intelligence noted that operations kept advancing when they expected delay. One German officer later wrote that the Americans were using machines like chains of living fuel, a metaphor for the endless convoys. German doctrine, which had emphasized static defense once supply lines stretched, was being undermined. The Wehrmacht was forced to build fallback lines faster, reinforce armor in areas they had considered safe, and begin delaying tactics rather than outright counterattack in some sectors. Reports from German staff suggested that paralyzing attacks by Patton's troops came as much from logistical superiority as tactical one. When supply backed mobility, the Americans attacked deeper, enveloped more ground, and forced German withdrawals rapidly. The Red Ball Road was not just pavement, it was the bleeding artery of Allied advance. Night or day, rain or shine, fuel flowed. The drivers were blood cells, the supplies oxygen for fighting machines. Without that artery, Patton's Third would have bled out. Sky that once threatened with bombers now watched the supply snake glow with lights. Road that once was torn by bombs became a ribbon of promise pushing east. Supply enabled speed. Speed forced German reaction. The Express proved that war is not won solely on the battlefield, but on the roads, in engine grease, in convoy discipline, in the will to keep engines rolling forward when fatigue and fear whispered to stop. The Red Ball Express was not just a logistical feat, it was a human story woven with courage, discrimination, sacrifice, and memory. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated. African American troops were often assigned to service and support roles rather than combat. Yet, in Red Ball, they formed its backbone. The Army's own Transportation Corps records note that about 73% of the motor transport service companies in the European theater were African American. Hence, most Red Ball units were black companies. The National WWII Museum further emphasizes this. 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American servicemen. These men were often not trained as truck drivers. Many had to learn on the job, but they stepped into roles others considered too risky or technical for them. The same system that denied them frontline roles now entrusted them with keeping the armies alive. Smithsonian recounts how many black drivers saw Red Ball as more than duty. It was a chance to prove ability. The black troops delivered gas under constant fire. They have what it takes. A tank commander with the 5th Armored later remarked, "If it wasn't for the Red Ball, we couldn't have moved." They all were black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat. Even among white soldiers, respect was grudgingly earned. The logistics truckers, often unseen, became heroes to tank crews who could only fight if they were fed gas shells and spare parts. Yet recognition lagged. Many black veterans of Red Ball returned home to segregation with limited medals and scant public acknowledgement. It was only decades later that memorials, documentaries, and academic work began to shine light on their sacrifice. The human burden was immense, but so was the strain on machines. Over 82 days, trucks were pushed to the brink. Warfare History Network notes. During the last week of August 1944 and the first week of September, Red Ball vehicles consumed more than 300,000 gallons of gasoline a day on their runs to the front. They carried everything: ammunition, rations, clothing, bridge sections, wire, spare parts, even candy and soft drinks. Every mile added wear. Tires shredded on jagged debris and sharp metal fragments. Engines overheated from constant use. Breakdowns were so frequent that many disabled trucks sat by the roadside, awaiting recovery. At one moment, on September 10th, 81 loaded vehicles were found waiting for servicing between Vire and Drew. Maps were often missing, parts scarce, tow trucks inadequate. Maintenance crews were overwhelmed. Some truck companies went days without servicing. MP forces, tasked to enforce road discipline and keep route traffic flowing, were stretched thin. Some convoys ignored MP orders entirely to expedite deliveries. The U.S. Army's own history notes that many trucks, once repaired, returned to the line despite worn parts or reduced performance, because delay was the greater enemy. By the last weeks, driver fatigue, mechanical unreliability, and supply of spare parts became limiting factors, not just enemy action. Amid the grind were human stories that escaped headlines. Some drivers sandbagged their cabs to reduce mine blast injuries, or installed hooks in jeeps to snag wires strung across roads. One veteran, PFC Myers, landed on the Normandy beach, smelled the stench of corpses, and shortly after became a Red Ball driver. He recalled the carnage and knew his mission was critical. Soldier stories reveal anxiety of drifting asleep at the wheel. In one case, a driver swerved to avoid a concrete pole after dozing and rejoined the road just in time. Some drivers reported being cut off, blocked by civilians or even by other military vehicles trying to commandeer Red Ball trucks for ad hoc use. Theft, black market raids, and misappropriation became significant hazards. Supplies from parked trucks were stolen. Soldiers from frontline units sometimes diverted fuel. These personal threads reveal that the Red Ball was not just a mechanical operation. It was human struggle across fatigue, stress, danger, and discrimination. As weeks stretched into months, the strain cracked more than engines. It cracked morale. The Army University Press notes that by the end of Red Ball, exhaustion was contributing to breakdown in discipline. Some trucks were abandoned. Supplies sold illicitly. Drivers fatigued beyond endurance. Vehicles were discarded when repair costs exceeded value. Some supplies were pilfered by locals or by soldiers. Instances of order violations, convoys stopping illegally, skipping maintenance, or ignoring intervals rose. Yet the mission continued. The men behind the wheels pressed forward not for praise, but because the front line needed them. They knew that if Red Ball paused, tanks would stall, bullets would dry, the offensive would slow, and their comrades would suffer. After November 16, 1944, when Red Ball operations officially ended, many drivers returned to their parent units. The tail end of the campaign saw new express routes: White Ball Express, Little Red Ball at sea, but none matched the scale, urgency, or symbolism of Red Ball. Later, the Army issued commemorative Red Ball patches. Colonel John S. D. Eisenhower, son of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, wrote that the spectacular nature of the advance through France was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks. In recent years, historians and museums have increased focus on the contribution of Red Ball's African American drivers. Smithsonian highlights how many white soldiers and commanders acknowledged their crucial role even then. Monuments, plaques, museum exhibits now commemorate them, not favorably in the 1940s, but increasingly so. Red Ball's story is finally garnering the recognition it deserves. Once the highway of life, Red Ball's arteries slowed as rail, ports, and pipelines took over. The trucks that once moved non-stop now tapered off. Fewer runs, shorter routes. Machines rusted. drivers moved on. As November 16, 1944 drew near, the Red Ball Express began its final runs. The convoy snakes that once stretched across France were being wound down, rail lines slowly healed. Ports came back. Pipelines took over. Yet the legacy of those 81 brutal, humming days would echo across military doctrine, cultural memory, and the face of logistics itself. By late October and early November, the necessity for the Red Ball Express diminished. Liberated ports like Antwerp were opening. French and Belgian rail lines, repaired by engineers and cleared of wreckage, began absorbing major tonnages. Pipelines carrying fuel closer to the front reduced the load on truck convoys. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express mission formally ended. The corridors of supply that had raced eastward were no longer needed in the same magnitude. But for those months, the trucks had carried more than cargo. They had carried momentum, hope, and strategic flexibility. Historical records report that during its operation, the Express carried over 412,193 tons of supplies. They logged more than 122 million ton miles. The Express was never meant to last forever. It was a pulse, a surge, but its impact stretched far beyond its lifespan. In October 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sent a message to the men of Red Ball Express. To you drivers and mechanics and your officers who keep the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving, you are doing an excellent job. That was no small praise. Eisenhower recognized that even the most powerful armies need a heartbeat of reliable supply. He saw that the Red Ball was not a support function, but a frontline enabler. Post-war, the U.S. Army's Transportation Corps formal histories credit Red Ball as one of the pivotal logistics feats of WWII, stating that the progress of the 1st and 3rd Armies could not have occurred but for the extraordinary effort of these service troops. Yet even in official histories, the contributions of African American drivers were often muted. As the Transportation Corps notes, to many historians these men were simply service troops. To survivors and descendants, they were pioneers proving valor under prejudice. Red Ball changed how armies see logistics. It proved that supply is not behind the war. It is part of the war. The capacity to move tons across distance, reliably and continuously, became a pillar of American expeditionary doctrine. Lessons absorbed. Priority routes, designating express highways solely for logistics, cleared of civilian use or interference. Convoy discipline rules. Spacing, speed regulation, enforcement by MPs. Mobile maintenance. Repair teams distributed along routes ready to patch or recover disabled vehicles. Integration of logistics with operational planning. Strategy must consider not just how far units can fight, but how far we can sustain them. Resilient multiple supply lines. Dependence on one modality rail, road, pipeline is risk. Red Ball's success derived from supplementing ports, trucks, pipelines. In military logistics literature to this day, Red Ball is cited as an archetype. How to turn a supply crisis into an operational advantage, how to push advance lines using motor transport, and how redundancy and improvisation matter. Red Ball transcends trucks and tonnage. It is a symbol of industrial democracy. The idea that infantry squads and armored spearheads alike could depend on a backbone of civilian-grade trucks running day and night challenged assumptions of traditional warfare. It showed how sheer industrial output, organizational audacity, and human grit could shift strategic possibilities. Culturally, Red Ball infused its way into memory. Monographs, museum exhibits, and transportation displays now memorialize it. In Patton Hall, U.S. Army Central Command, a monograph display was unveiled commemorating the Red Ball Express and its drivers. Historical writers and logistic theorists reference Red Ball in discussions of modern conflicts, supply chain warfare, and mobility doctrine. African American military heritage narratives often elevate Red Ball as a case where black soldiers, under systemic racism, nonetheless delivered victory materially and morally. The memory matters. Those drivers, many unheralded, now appear in documentaries, museum walls, and educational curricula. One cannot overstate how closely allied momentum in late 1944 hinged on supply. If Red Ball had failed, if breakdowns outpaced repairs, if rail and port options had lagged further, if drivers had mutinied or morale collapsed, the Third Army would have stalled. A standstill in August or September would have given Germany precious time to regroup, rearm, erect defensive lines, perhaps prolong the war by months. Some historians estimate that the Red Ball Express may have shortened the European campaign by up to 6 months, though such claims must be treated with caution. The counterfactual is impossible to prove. But even conservative estimates agree it eliminated logistical pauses that would otherwise bog down advances. The Germans, confident in their own logistical rigor, had never anticipated such a mobile supply network. When they heard engines at night, when their map showed no supply nodes that far east, they realized they were facing not just an army, but an industrial civilization on wheels. Throughout this narrative, the motif of road plus engine plus blood returns. The highway was the artery of victory. Trucks were blood cells, supplies the life force. Even now, when we look back, the image of headlights at midnight, engines humming through French fields, remains indelible. The supply artery may now be dormant, but its imprint remains in doctrine, in memory, and in every modern military supply plan that echoes the lessons of the Red Ball Express. The Red Ball Express was never meant to be the centerpiece of battle. It was meant to be the lifeline. But in that role, it became central. The drivers, maintenance crews, commanders who ran those convoys did not wear glory on the front lines, but they forged mobility with steel and sweat, to echo the words of military historians. The spectacular nature of the Allied advance through France was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks. Without the Express, tanks would have stalled, bullets would have gone unfired, momentum would have slowed. But with it, the Allied armies kept rolling, dragging German resistance eastward until collapse. In the end, what began as a desperate improvisation became a benchmark. The Red Ball Express taught the world. Logistics is not an afterthought. It is the engine of war. And sometimes, the quiet hum of diesel on ruined roads is the loudest sound history hears.